Imagine this. You are crouched behind a marble column inside the Vatican's most sacred halls. The air is heavy with incense, mixed with something far more intoxicating. The year is 1501 AD. Through the shifting shadows of flickering candelabras, you see what no one should ever witness. Within holy walls, the soft sound of silk brushing against stone mingles with bursts of laughter, echoing through corridors where saints once walked. Your heartbeat quickens as you realize you are about to see the most scandalous night in papal history, an orgy so shocking it would have embarrassed even the Romans of antiquity. The cool October air drifts through the Vatican apartments, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts. Yet tonight, these simple nuts will be turned into props for a performance that will forever taint the Catholic Church's reputation. In the private chambers of Cesare Borgia, son of Pope Alexander VI, 50 courtesans gather, preparing for an evening that would later be described in one of Renaissance Rome's most secret diaries. This hidden account was preserved for centuries in the Vatican archives, locked away like a forbidden confession, buried beneath layers of solemn prayers. Before we dive further into these forgotten tales of survival and scandal, let me pause for a moment. If you enjoy uncovering the hidden truths of history, make sure to hit the like button and subscribe for more stories like this. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. I always find it incredible that we're exploring these old histories together, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity. The man remembered as the most corrupt and immoral pope in history was born Rodrigo de Borja on January 1st, 1431 AD, in the Spanish town of Játiva, near Valencia. The dust of Spain's roads clung to his earliest memories, but destiny pulled him far from those humble beginnings into the marble corridors of Vatican power. His uncle, Alfonso de Borja, had already risen high within the church. When Alfonso became Pope Calixtus III in 1455 AD, young Rodrigo's future was sealed as firmly as wax pressed onto a papal bull. At just 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal deacon, not because of divine calling or spiritual devotion, but through the entrenched practice of nepotism that flowed through the church like poison through a sick body. The ambitious Spaniard arrived in Rome with hunger in his eyes and a fire in his chest, ready to seize every opportunity the eternal city could offer. Rome in the late 15th century was a place of extremes, a city of contradictions so deep they would have made Dante himself weep in recognition. By day, pilgrims knelt in devotion before glittering altars, their prayers rising like smoke toward heaven. By night, however, the same streets turned into something very different, a marketplace where deals were struck that made traders of flesh richer than they had ever imagined. The papal court itself had become a kind of bazaar where even salvation carried a price measured not in faith, but in golden ducats. Rodrigo de Borja knew how to thrive in this world better than most. He built his fortune with the steady patience of a spider spinning its web, gathering church benefices from all across Europe as if they were jewels to be hoarded. His daily life resembled that of a Renaissance prince, far more than that of a servant of God. banquets overflowing with food and wine, palaces decorated with grandeur, and a long line of mistresses who bore him children with a regularity as predictable as the passing of the seasons. The most important of these liaisons was with Vanozza Catanei, a Roman noblewoman whose beauty was matched by her sharp understanding of papal politics. Between 1474 and 1482 AD, she gave Rodrigo 4 children: Juan, Cesare, Lucrezia, and Jofre. Each of them would become a crucial piece in their father's great game of power, their lives shaped, and in many ways sacrificed to feed his endless ambition. Even during his years as a cardinal, Rodrigo's behavior shocked the city, and this was no easy task in Rome, where scandal was as common as the morning loaf of bread. In 1460 AD, Pope Pius II himself wrote a harsh letter rebuking Rodrigo for his conduct in Siena, which had scandalized both the town and the papal court. But Rodrigo was unmoved. For him, shame was a weakness he could not afford. He had set his sights on the papal throne, and in that pursuit, questions of morality were obstacles to be bypassed, not principles to be respected. The conclave of August 1492 AD unfolded like a carefully staged play of corruption. Inside the Sistine Chapel, beneath the ceiling that Michelangelo would one day transform into a masterpiece, 23 cardinals gathered to choose the next vicar of Christ. Behind those closed doors, gold passed from hand to hand as easily as water poured from a jug. Promises were exchanged in hushed voices that sounded almost like prayers, and rich benefices were handed out as freely as communion wafers. When the smoke rose on August 11th, 1492 AD, Rodrigo de Borja emerged as Pope Alexander VI. His victory was no mystery. Everyone knew it had been bought through blatant simony, the selling and purchasing of sacred offices, and yet Rome celebrated. The citizens had grown accustomed to the Spanish cardinal, and they expected a reign filled with grandeur and vitality. Bonfires blazed across the 7 hills. Torch-lit processions wound through ancient streets, and triumphal arches rose as if the city itself were offering prayers carved in wood and stone. On August 26th, Alexander VI was crowned in St. Peter's Basilica, receiving what chroniclers described as the loudest and most enthusiastic ovation ever given to a pope. At first, his reign seemed to hold promise. He brought order back to Rome's streets, which had been plagued by more than 200 assassinations in the months before his election. He divided the city into districts overseen by magistrates tasked with maintaining peace. He even held open audiences every Tuesday, where he listened to grievances personally and handed down judgments with a speed and fairness that many praised as remarkable. For a short time, it seemed that divine providence had truly placed the right man on the throne of St. Peter. But power does not create character, it reveals it. Alexander's early reforms were quickly overshadowed by his obsession with advancing the fortunes of his children, especially his sons Juan and Cesare. Juan was granted the title of Duke of Gandia in Spain and married to a cousin of the Spanish king. Cesare, though only 18 years old, was appointed Archbishop of Valencia, and soon after elevated to the rank of cardinal, offices he treated not as sacred duties, but as mere stepping stones in his career. Under Alexander's rule, the papal apartments turned into a stage where the sacred and the profane performed side by side in an obscene ballet. Lavish dinners stretched late into the night, accompanied by entertainments so extravagant and morally questionable that even by the looser standards of the Renaissance, they raised eyebrows. Alexander's mistress, Julia Farnese, celebrated across Rome as Julia la Bella for her stunning beauty, moved through the Vatican's corridors with the ease of a cardinal. Her presence was a daily reminder that the Pope's vows of celibacy had long been discarded in favor of earthly passions. Into this world of contradictions stepped Johann Burchard, a sharp-eyed observer, armed with a quill and a tireless memory. Born around 1450 AD in Niederhaslach, Alsace, Burchard had studied canon law and climbed the ecclesiastical ranks until he became the papal master of ceremonies. The post gave him privileged access to the innermost moments of papal life. Starting in 1483 AD, under Pope Sixtus IV, he began keeping his Liber Notarum, a meticulous diary that chronicled not only the grandeur of official ceremonies, but also the scandals that swirled around 5 different popes. Burchard was no romantic. He wrote with the mind of an accountant and the eye of a court stenographer. His records lacked the embellishments of other chroniclers, yet their dry, matter-of-fact tone made them all the more credible. He described papal liturgies with the same precision he applied to papal debauchery, creating a documentary so unsettling that even hardened Vatican archivists would later find it difficult to read. As master of ceremonies, Burchard held a rare position within the papal hierarchy. He was not powerful enough to join the corruption, but not insignificant enough to be excluded from its view. Like a shadow cast by candlelight, he slipped unnoticed through the Vatican's private chambers, quietly observing while appearing almost invisible. Cardinals trusted him with ceremonial details, and then forgot his presence when they should have remembered it most. That invisibility became his greatest weapon as a recorder of papal vice. By the late 1490s AD, the behavior of the Borja family was drawing scrutiny across Europe. Alexander's eldest son, Juan, now Duke of Gandia, revealed himself to be as corrupt as his title was undeserved. Rumors spread of his cruelty, his sexual excesses, and his failures as a military commander. The golden heir of the Borja dynasty was turning into a liability, one his father could no longer ignore. Then came June 14th, 1497 AD, the night everything changed. Juan's body was found floating in the Tiber River, his throat slit and his flesh marked by 9 deep wounds. The murder sent shockwaves through Rome and struck Pope Alexander with such grief that many whispered it was divine justice finally falling upon the Borgia family. For 3 days and nights, the pontiff neither ate nor slept. Behind closed doors, he wept like a broken man, not like the powerful pope who had once made kings tremble. In his sorrow, Alexander announced a program of church reform. He called for restrictions on the excesses of the papal court, a reorganization of the apostolic chancery, and measures to suppress simony and concubinage. For a brief moment, it seemed as if personal tragedy might accomplish what years of public criticism had failed to do. A commission of cardinals and canonists even began drafting ordinances that foreshadowed the great reforms of the Council of Trent, still decades away. But grief, like every other emotion in Alexander's life, soon passed. Within months, the reform proposals were abandoned, tucked away like embarrassing love letters, never meant to be read again. The Pope's focus shifted to his surviving children, especially Cesare, whose iron will and ruthless ambition would now carry the family's destiny forward. If Juan had been Alexander's heart, Cesare was his sword, sharp, cold, and merciless. Cesare had a magnetic presence that attracted both admiration and hatred. Tall, strikingly handsome, and endowed with an intelligence that bordered on genius, he had originally been groomed for the church, just as his father had been. But Cesare's gifts lay not in theology, but in war and statecraft. In 1498 AD, he did the unthinkable. He resigned his cardinalate, becoming the first cardinal in history to voluntarily renounce the office and set his eyes firmly on worldly power. The Italian political landscape of the late 15th century offered him opportunities that could have tested even Machiavelli's imagination. King Louis XV of France sought papal approval to annul his marriage, while the patchwork of Italian duchies and city-states offered fertile ground for conquest by any commander ruthless enough to seize them. Alexander saw in these circumstances the chance to carve out a kingdom for his son, even if it required allying with foreign invaders against fellow Italians. Through a ruthless combination of sieges, assassinations, and political intrigue, Cesare carved out a dominion in central Italy that made him one of Europe's most feared men. His methods were so effective that Niccolò Machiavelli later used him as the model for The Prince, admiring Cesare's ability to blend cruelty with cold efficiency in pursuit of power. Yet such ambitions demanded resources greater than even the papal treasury could supply. To fund his projects, Alexander turned increasingly to creative and corrupt methods of raising money. The sale of indulgences, church offices, and even cardinals' hats became standard practice under his reign. Wealthy families could buy ecclesiastical positions for their sons, securing not only influence, but what they believed to be salvation. By the end of his pontificate, Alexander had created 47 new cardinals, men elevated not for their spiritual worth, but for the gold they could provide. Each new appointment meant thousands of ducats pouring into the papal treasury and ultimately into Cesare's war chest. Rome, during these years, often felt less like the capital of Christendom and more like a city occupied by its own rulers. The Borgia family treated the papal states as their private kingdom, with Alexander as patriarch and Cesare as his crown prince. Lucrezia, despite the later rehabilitation of her reputation, was used as a political pawn in marriage alliances that served the family's interests, not her own happiness. Her first marriage to Giovanni Sforza was annulled on the grounds of impotence when circumstances shifted, and she was soon remarried to Alfonso of Bisceglie. When that alliance lost its value, Alfonso was murdered, very likely on Cesare's orders, inside the Vatican apartments life became a theater of extravagance. Alexander delighted in elaborate entertainments, plays, musical performances, and banquets that stretched well past midnight. His guest list included cardinals, ambassadors, wealthy merchants, and courtesans whose beauty was matched only by their ability to keep secrets or their willingness to ignore discretion altogether. These gatherings served purposes beyond simple amusement. They displayed papal wealth and authority, doubled as opportunities for quiet political negotiation, and acted as tests of loyalty. Cardinals who attended were, in effect, implicated in the Pope's behavior, making them hesitant to ever oppose him. Those who refused invitations risked branding themselves as enemies, and the Borgias had shown more than once what became of their enemies. By the autumn of 1501 AD, the Borgia family stood at the height of both its power and its corruption. Cesare had completed his conquest of the Romagna, earning admiration from military observers across Europe. Alexander had survived political storms, from the invasion of Charles the Vervoith to bitter feuds with noble rivals. The Jubilee year of 1500 had drawn hundreds of thousands of pilgrims to Rome, filling the papal treasury, and just as abundantly, the city's brothels. It was in this atmosphere of triumph and moral collapse that Cesare Borgia conceived what would become infamous as the Banquet of Chestnuts. The motives remain debated even today. Was it meant as a celebration, a calculated piece of political theater, or simply the inevitable climax of years of reckless excess? Contemporary witnesses gave different explanations, but they all agreed on the essentials, facts so shocking that even seasoned observers of papal corruption struggled to believe them. The night was October 31st, 1501 AD, All Hallows' Eve, the very evening when, by tradition, the line between the sacred and the profane was at its thinnest. Whether by design or by chance, the choice of date carried a dark symbolism. The most notorious papal orgy in history unfolded on a night when, by tradition, the spirits of the dead were said to roam freely among the living. If it was deliberate, the irony was perfect. On a night dedicated to honoring the departed, the Borgia family staged a spectacle that buried what little dignity remained of the papacy. The event took place in Cesare's apartments within the Vatican, a section of the papal palace lavishly decorated in the early years of Alexander's reign by the painter Pinturicchio. The frescoed walls displayed scenes from both classical mythology and Christian history, an almost mocking backdrop for an evening that belonged to neither world. Rooms meant to showcase papal wealth and cultural refinement instead became the setting for the very excesses that critics accused the Borgias of embodying. The guest list reflected just how deeply corruption had spread. Cardinals, who ought to have been at prayer, mingled freely with Roman nobles, whose wealth had bought them immunity from scandal. Diplomats from across Europe were also present, some likely hoping to gather intelligence on papal politics, others perhaps merely curious to see just how far the Borgias would go in testing the limits of decency. But the true centerpiece of the evening was the group of 50 courtesans assembled by Cesare for his guests' pleasure. These were not common women taken from Rome's streets. but refined courtesans skilled in the art of pleasure and, equally important, discretion. Many were veterans of earlier papal entertainments. They knew the expectations, the risks, and the rewards that came from satisfying men of influence. Johann Burchard, the papal master of ceremonies, was also present that evening, not as a participant, but as an observer. His position required him to be available in case any formal ceremonial duties arose, even at private gatherings. It was his pen, detached and unsentimental, that would later record the shocking details of what transpired on that All Hallows Eve. This professional duty placed Johann Burchard in the ideal position to witness and record events that most others would have preferred erased from memory. His account, written in Latin with the cold precision of a medical examiner, preserves details that not only describe what happened that night, but also reveal the broader moral atmosphere of Alexander VI's papacy. According to Burchard's careful notes, the evening began in an almost conventional manner. Dinner was served in Cesare's private chambers, offering seasonal delicacies fit for the rank of the guests, along with fine wines drawn from the papal cellars, long aged in the cool caves beneath Rome. Conversation flowed as easily as the drink, ranging across politics, military exploits, and artistic patronage, subjects that allowed the company to showcase their culture and refinement. The tone shifted after the dishes were cleared away, when the true entertainment of the evening began. 50 courtesans, dressed in silks and velvets, chosen to highlight their physical allure, entered and began to dance for the assembled company. Musicians, sworn to secrecy about what they witnessed, played rhythms that encouraged ever more intimate movement. As Burchard observed with his usual precision, the women began fully clothed. But as the wine continued to flow and the night wore on, garments were gradually removed, step by step. What began as elegant performance turned into open display, until eventually the courtesans danced completely naked before their audience. The transformation was slow enough that no guest could claim surprise, yet firm enough that the final direction of the night became undeniable. Then came the spectacle that gave the gathering its infamous name. Servants removed the candelabras from the tables and placed them on the floor throughout the room, creating scattered pools of flickering light, broken by stretches of shadow. It was in this strange, theatrical glow that the evening crossed from scandal into legend. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor between the glowing candelabras, and the nude courtesans were ordered to crawl on hands and knees to collect them. Their bodies caught the flicker of the candlelight as they moved through the improvised course, shadows stretching and trembling across the frescoed walls. According to Burchard's record, Pope Alexander VI himself watched from a seat of honor, flanked by Cesare and his daughter Lucrezia. The presence of Lucrezia at such an event has puzzled historians for centuries. Was she a willing accomplice in her family's corruption, or merely trapped in circumstances she could not control? Contemporary sources disagree, yet all confirm her presence as the evening descended to its most infamous depths. The final phase of the spectacle was a competition among the male guests, who could couple with the greatest number of courtesans. Prizes were promised: tunics of silk, fine shoes, caps, and other luxury items of high value. In an age when such goods were painstakingly handmade, servants were tasked with keeping score, tallying the conquests like points in a tournament. What should have been private human intimacy was transformed into a grotesque public contest, staged for the amusement of the papal household. Burchard's account of these proceedings was preserved in the Vatican secret archives, locked away for centuries. When Pope Leo III opened those archives to scholars in the late 19th century, he voiced particular hesitation about releasing documents that might further tarnish Alexander VI's name. That such caution was deemed necessary more than 400 years later speaks to the enduring scandal of what Burchard so carefully recorded. The morning after the banquet of chestnuts, Rome outwardly appeared unchanged. Pilgrims continued to crowd St. Peter's Basilica. Cardinals met in their scheduled sessions, and the Pope himself appeared in public as if nothing unusual had occurred. Yet beneath the surface, the foundations of spiritual authority had been shaken. Rumors raced through the networks of servants, guards, and lesser officials who had witnessed or heard whispers of the night before. Word spread quickly beyond Rome as well, carried in the reports of foreign ambassadors, some present at the banquet, others informed by trusted sources. The scandal traveled across Europe, embedding itself into the dark legend of the Borgia papacy. Letters preserved in European archives reveal the shock and disgust felt by those who believed nothing in papal behavior could still surprise them. Even the envoys of secular rulers, men accustomed to the moral compromises of their own courts, expressed amazement that such depravity had unfolded within the sacred walls of the Vatican. The scandal's impact stretched well beyond questions of personal morality. Reformers across Europe, including fiery voices like Savonarola in Florence, seized upon reports of the banquet as proof that the papacy had sunk into unrecoverable corruption. Demands for a church council to depose Alexander VI gained fresh urgency, bolstered by accounts of conduct that seemed to confirm the darkest accusations against the Borgia Pope. Alexander's reaction was entirely in character, defiance rather than remorse. He offered no apology, no reforms. Instead, he doubled down, pouring greater support into Cesare's military campaigns and continuing to live with the same extravagance that had defined his reign. Far from restraining him, the scandal almost seemed to liberate him, as if once his corruption was laid bare, he no longer felt any need to pretend to virtue. The banquet of chestnuts came near the end of his papacy, but it was not an isolated lapse. It was the natural climax of years of steadily escalating excess that had transformed the papal court into something unrecognizable to earlier generations of Christians. The sacred and the profane had become so entangled that separating them was nearly impossible, and few had the will to try. Cesare Borgia's career, meanwhile, continued to flourish in the wake of the scandal, proof that moral outrage rarely outweighed political necessity in Renaissance Italy. His military triumphs still won admiration from those who valued results above character. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing later, analyzed Cesare's methods with clear-eyed precision, separating political genius from moral virtue and insisting that true rulers must be prepared to use any means required to secure power. Yet power founded on corruption, proved fragile. Alexander VI died not long after, leaving behind a court drenched in scandal, a family both feared and hated, and a legacy that reformers and critics would wield for centuries as the ultimate symbol of a church in need of cleansing. On August 18th, 1503 AD, Pope Alexander VI died, likely from malaria, though whispers of poisoning spread quickly, echoing the atmosphere of suspicion and violence that had marked his reign. His death brought immediate consequences for his children. Cesare, stripped of papal protection, saw his political power vanish almost overnight. Just 4 years later, he was killed in Spain, no longer a feared prince, but a soldier for hire. Lucrezia, by contrast, survived and became Duchess of Ferrara, but her later life never fully escaped the weight of her family's scandalous reputation. The new pope, Julius II, refused to reside in the Borgia apartments where the banquet of chestnuts had taken place. Instead, he relocated to the rooms directly above, commissioning Raphael to decorate them with frescoes that would become some of the most admired works in the Vatican history. This move was more than practical. It symbolized a deliberate effort to distance the papacy from the moral failures of Alexander's court. Yet restoring the church's reputation would prove far harder than restoring its living spaces. Historians through the centuries have debated the truth of Burchard's account. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, Catholic scholars often questioned whether such extreme behavior could have been reliably recorded, suggesting later alterations may have exaggerated the story. Protestant historians, however, embraced the account as damning evidence against papal authority and Catholic claims of moral leadership. Today, most modern historians accept Burchard's chronicle as broadly accurate, but stress the need to place it within the larger culture of Renaissance Italy. They note that spectacles involving prostitutes, sexual contests, and public entertainments were not unusual among secular rulers. What made Alexander's banquet uniquely scandalous was not the behavior itself, but the fact that it occurred under the roof of the papacy, with the Pope presiding. Even the location added a layer of irony. The grand halls of the Vatican, meant to embody holiness and authority, became the stage for an orgy that future generations would hold up as the clearest example of a church in moral collapse. The memory of that October night lingered long after Alexander VI was gone, staining both his legacy and the institution he had led. The rooms where the orgies took place had been decorated by Pinturicchio, with frescoes illustrating episodes from both classical mythology and Christian history. Ancient gods and Christian saints alike looked down from painted walls as scenes unfolded that would have scandalized both pagan and Christian sensibilities. The contrast created a kind of visual commentary on the distance between artistic ideals and human reality, as divine figures were forced to bear silent witness to human excess. Archaeological investigations of the Vatican apartments have shed light on the physical layout that made such events possible within the papal palace. The Borgia apartments were designed with a series of interconnected chambers and corridors, allowing for the smooth transition between public ceremonies and private entertainments. Layers of stone and plaster provided soundproofing between rooms, ensuring that what happened in one chamber could remain concealed from those in the next. This architecture offered precisely the privacy required for Alexander's increasingly extreme indulgences. The preservation of Burchard's diary within the Vatican secret archives raises equally revealing questions about the Church's relationship to its own history. For centuries, these documents remained sealed away, accessible only to select researchers granted special papal permission. The choice to preserve them while simultaneously restricting access suggests a deep ambivalence, a recognition of their historical importance, tempered by acute embarrassment over their contents. Contemporary sources beyond Burchard provide corroboration for at least some version of the infamous banquet. Diplomatic correspondence from the period contains veiled references to papal entertainments that strained the limits of moral acceptability, while few other accounts match the explicit detail that makes Burchard's diary so compelling. The convergence of multiple reports pointing to similar conclusions lends weight to the basic historicity of the Banquet of Chestnuts. The scandal's impact on papal history cannot be measured solely by its immediate political fallout. Alexander VI's behavior, culminating in events like the banquet, furnished Protestant reformers with some of their strongest evidence in arguing that the papacy had grown irredeemably corrupt. To them, Alexander was not merely a bad pope. He embodied the very moral collapse that made reform, or even revolution, seem necessary. Martin Luther's criticisms of papal authority gained traction because they were supported by well-documented examples of moral failure at the very top of the church hierarchy. The Counter-Reformation that began in the mid-16th century was, in part, a direct response to scandals like the Banquet of Chestnuts. Church leaders understood that moral reform was essential to restore papal credibility and to counter Protestant attacks. The Council of Trent's insistence on stricter clerical discipline and its establishment of seminaries for priestly training directly addressed problems so vividly illustrated by Alexander VI's conduct. But reform came at a cost that went beyond new rules. The Baroque splendor of post-Tridentine papal ceremonies reflected an effort to project dignity through carefully staged ritual and visual magnificence. The casual, spontaneous entertainments of Alexander's court gave way to tightly controlled spectacles designed to highlight papal majesty while reducing any risk of scandal. The psychological toll of events, like the Banquet of Chestnuts, is harder to measure from a distance of centuries. For the courtesans who performed that night, it was likely a matter of professional obligation rather than personal shame. Economic necessity left little room for moral choice. For the church officials present, the evening may have meant either willing participation in corruption or reluctant compliance, shaped by fear of displeasing the Pope and facing career-ending consequences. The wider Roman public's reaction also reveals the complex relationship between religious authority and popular devotion. Despite knowing of Alexander's moral failings, pilgrims still poured into Rome. Masses continued to be celebrated, and the sacraments remained central to daily life. This suggests that ordinary Catholics had developed a theological resilience, the ability to distinguish between the unworthiness of church leaders and the continued validity of religious rites. The banquet of chestnuts was more than a single act of papal misconduct. It symbolized a broader shift in Renaissance Italy, marking the transition from medieval Christendom to the early modern European state system. Alexander II's behavior reflected the habits of secular princes who used wealth and spectacle to display their power. But unlike kings or dukes, his position as spiritual leader of Catholic Christianity created contradictions too stark to ignore. The evening of October 31st, 1501, AD stands as a turning point in papal history. It was the moment when the clash between spiritual authority and worldly ambition reached a breaking point, demanding resolution. From then on, every pope faced the same dilemma: whether to pursue worldly magnificence or moral credibility. That choice would shape the Catholic Church for centuries. Looking back more than 5 centuries later, at that candlelit night in the Vatican apartments, we see in it a timeless reflection of humanity's struggle between sacred aspirations and worldly desires. The chestnuts scattered across the marble floors became more than food. They became a symbol of how far dignity can fall when power escapes moral restraint. The lesson still resonates today. Spiritual leaders continue to fail. Power continues to corrupt, and human weakness endures even among those called to serve higher ideals. The banquet of chestnuts remains both a historical scandal and an enduring warning. The candles that lit that notorious night burned out long ago. The participants have long since turned to dust in Roman graves, and the very rooms where it all took place now display masterpieces admired by quiet, reverent tourists. But Burchard's precise Latin prose preserves those rare moments when the boundary between the sacred and the profane collapsed entirely, when the Vicar of Christ became indistinguishable from the most debauched of Roman emperors, and when chestnuts scattered across marble floors testified to the gulf between human ambition and divine calling. In the end, perhaps that is the true significance of Alexander VI's forbidden orgy, not merely proof of one man's moral corruption, but a mirror held up to humanity itself, revealing our enduring capacity for both transcendence and degradation. The same species that raised cathedrals toward heaven and painted visions of the divine also gathered in papal chambers to watch spectacles that shattered the very foundations of spiritual authority. The chestnuts strewn across those Vatican floors were swept away before dawn, yet the questions they symbolize about power, faith, and human nature remain scattered across the floors of history, waiting for each generation to decide how to reckon with the legacy of the most corrupt pope ever to claim the keys of heaven.